The sound of distant thunder rumbled across the dusty plains as Elizabeth Morgan stood trembling, her wrists raw from the rough hemp rope that bound her to the weathered fence post. Her once pristine blue dress was now tattered and stained with the red clay soil of Texas, 1875, and her honey-blonde hair, normally pinned in a neat bun, fell in tangled strands around her tear-streaked face. Elizabeth closed her eyes against the harsh afternoon sun, thinking of how quickly her escape attempt had failed. Just 3 hours ago, she'd taken her stepfather's horse, intending to flee to San Antonio and perhaps find work as a seamstress. But he'd caught up to her on the outskirts of Willow Creek, dragging her back to this desolate stretch of his ranch, tying her to the fence post with a promise to teach her a lesson about disobedience when he returned from town. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart race with fear. Too soon for her stepfather to be returning, and coming from the wrong direction. Elizabeth struggled against her bonds, wincing as the rope cut deeper into her already damaged skin. "Easy there, miss," came a deep voice, gentle despite its roughness. Elizabeth's eyes flew open to see a tall figure on horseback, silhouetted against the setting sun. As he dismounted and approached, she could make out a weather-beaten face beneath the brim of a dusty brown hat. His eyes, a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, regarded her with concern. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking from thirst. "He'll be back soon." The stranger's expression hardened as he took in her situation. Without a word, he drew a knife from his belt and stepped behind the post. Elizabeth felt the tension on her wrists release as he cut through the rope with a single swift motion. "I'm Wyatt Reed," he said, sheathing his knife and reaching for his canteen. "Drink this." Elizabeth took the offered water with shaking hands, gulping it gratefully. "Elizabeth Morgan," she managed between sips. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." Wyatt's eyes scanned the horizon, then returned to her face. "Who did this to you, Miss Morgan?" "My stepfather, Harold Bentley," she replied, attempting to rub feeling back into her wrists. "He owns the Doubleby Ranch." Recognition flashed in Wyatt's eyes. "Bentley? I've heard tales of his temper." He hesitated, then added, "You can't stay here." "I have nowhere to go," Elizabeth admitted. "I was trying to reach San Antonio when he caught me." Wyatt glanced at his horse, then back at Elizabeth. "My ranch is a half-day's ride north. You'd be safe there until we figure something out." Elizabeth studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. All she saw was compassion and something else, a quiet strength that made her want to trust him despite years of learning not to trust any man. "Why would you help me?" she asked cautiously. A ghost of a smile touched Wyatt's lips. "My ma raised me to never turn my back on someone in need." He extended his hand. "What do you say, Miss Morgan?" The sound of distant horses made the decision for her. Elizabeth placed her hand in his, surprised by its warmth despite the calluses. "Call me Elizabeth," she said. Wyatt's smile deepened as he helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her. "Hold tight, Elizabeth. We've got a long ride ahead." As they rode away, Elizabeth could feel the steady beat of Wyatt's heart against her back, a strange counterpoint to her own racing pulse. For the first time in years, she felt something dangerous bloom within her chest. Hope. The prairie stretched endlessly before them as Wyatt guided his horse northward, keeping to the cover of scattered cottonwoods and shallow ravines whenever possible. Elizabeth remained silent, acutely aware of his arms around her as he held the reins. The afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the land and painting the sky in hues of amber and gold. "We'll stop soon to rest the horse," Wyatt said, his breath warm against her ear. "There's a creek about a mile ahead where we can get fresh water." Elizabeth nodded, too exhausted to speak. Her body ached from the ordeal and the long ride, but she forced herself to stay alert. Her stepfather wouldn't give up easily. He had invested too much in acquiring her mother's land through their marriage to let Elizabeth escape. The creek appeared as Wyatt had promised, a silver ribbon winding through a stand of cottonwoods. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Elizabeth down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground. "Easy there," Wyatt said, supporting her until she found her balance. "Sit here in the shade. I'll tend to Thunder." Elizabeth sank gratefully onto a flat rock while Wyatt led his horse to water. She watched him remove the saddle, noting the gentle way he spoke to the animal as he rubbed it down with a handful of dry grass. There was a quiet competence in his movements that she found reassuring. "How far is your ranch?" she asked when he returned to offer her more water and a strip of dried beef from his saddlebag. "About 4 more hours of riding," Wyatt replied, settling beside her but maintaining a respectful distance. "My foreman, Frank, will be wondering where I got to. I was just checking fence lines when I found you." Elizabeth studied him openly now. His face was lean and weathered, with laugh lines around his eyes despite his serious expression. She guessed him to be in his early 30s, perhaps 10 years her senior. His clothes were practical worn leather chaps over denim trousers, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up revealing corded forearms, and that dusty brown hat that had seen better days. "You own a ranch?" she asked, surprised that someone so young could have established himself already. Wyatt nodded. "The lazy are. It's not much compared to some spreads 800 acres, about 500 head of cattle. But it's mine, free and clear." There was pride in his voice, and Elizabeth felt a twinge of envy for his independence. "How long have you had it?" "Going on 5 years now." Wyatt took a drink from the canteen. "Started as a hand on the Barton place when I was 16, worked my way up to foreman. Saved every penny I could. Then old man McCready decided to sell his place and move to California. The land was played out, they said not enough water. But I found a way to make it work." "That's impressive," Elizabeth said sincerely. Wyatt shrugged, but she could tell her words pleased him. "What about you? How did you end up with Bentley?" Elizabeth's expression clouded. "My father died when I was 12. Typhoid. Mother struggled to keep our small ranch going, but it was too much for her alone. Bentley started calling, bringing gifts, offering help. He seemed kind at first." She paused, the painful memories making her voice tight. "They married when I was 15. Mother died last winter pneumonia, the doctor said, but she just seemed to fade away after realizing what kind of man she'd tied herself to. And Bentley showed his true colors," Wyatt guessed. Elizabeth nodded. "He owns everything now. The ranch, the cattle, even my mother's jewelry. And—" she hesitated. "He's determined I should marry his business partner, Edgar Whitmore. He's nearly 60 and has buried 3 wives already." Wyatt's expression darkened. "That explains why he was so determined to catch you." "Yes, the wedding was to be next Sunday." Elizabeth looked down at her torn dress. "I couldn't bear it, so I took his fastest horse and ran." "You did right," Wyatt said firmly. "No one should be forced to marry against their will." Elizabeth gave him a grateful look. "Thank you for saying that. Not everyone would agree." "Well, I'm not everyone." Wyatt stood and offered his hand. "We should keep moving. Bentley knows these lands too well for us to linger." As they continued their journey, the shadows lengthened and merged until darkness enveloped the prairie. The moon rose, nearly full, casting enough light for Wyatt to navigate. Elizabeth found herself leaning back against his chest, fatigue overcoming her fear. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, fighting to stay awake. Wyatt's voice rumbled pleasantly as he described the small but sturdy house he'd built with his own hands, the barn with its hayloft where barn cats kept the mice at bay, the bunkhouse where his 3 ranch hands slept, and the creek that ran year-round, ensuring his cattle always had water. "It's not much," he concluded, "but someday I aim to make it something special." "It sounds wonderful already," Elizabeth murmured, her eyes growing heavy despite her efforts. "Sleep if you need to," Wyatt said gently. "I won't let you fall." Something in his voice made her believe him. Elizabeth allowed her eyes to close, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her and the solid presence of the man behind her. She woke to Wyatt gently shaking her shoulder. "Elizabeth, we're here." The moon illuminated a small ranch house nestled against a rise, a barn and corral visible nearby. A dog began barking, and a light appeared in one of the windows. "That'll be Frank," Wyatt said, dismounting and helping Elizabeth down. "He's a good man, but he'll have questions." As if on cue, the front door opened, and a lantern emerged, followed by a stocky figure with a shotgun. "That you, boss?" called a gruff voice. "It's me, Frank. Put that shotgun away before you scare the lady." The lantern approached, revealing a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and suspicious eyes. He lowered the shotgun but kept a firm grip on it. "What lady?" "This is Miss Elizabeth Morgan," Wyatt said, keeping a supportive hand at her elbow. "She needs our help. Miss Morgan, this is Frank Donovan, my foreman and right-hand man." Frank's expression remained wary, but he touched the brim of his nightcap in a respectful gesture. "Madam, Mr. Donovan," Elizabeth acknowledged, suddenly very conscious of her bedraggled appearance and the compromising situation arriving at night, alone with Wyatt. Wyatt seemed to read her thoughts. "Frank, Miss Morgan will be staying in my room. I'll bunk with you boys. Please wake Miguel and have him see to Thunder. The poor beast has carried double for most of the day." Frank's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. "Yes, sir. Should I wake Mrs. Peterson too? The lady looks like she could use some tending." "Please," Wyatt said. "And Frank, this needs to stay quiet. If anyone comes asking, Miss Morgan isn't here." Understanding dawned on Frank's face. "Trouble? Could be," Wyatt admitted. "I'll explain tomorrow." Frank nodded and headed toward a small building set apart from the main house, presumably the bunkhouse. Wyatt guided Elizabeth toward the house. "Mrs. Peterson is our cook," he explained. "She's a widow who needed work, and I needed someone who could make food that doesn't taste like leather. She's got a sharp tongue but a good heart." The interior of the house was simple but clean, with a main room containing a sturdy table and chairs, a stone fireplace, and several comfortable-looking armchairs. A short hallway led to what Elizabeth assumed were bedrooms. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Wyatt looked pleased. "It's nothing fancy, but it's home." He hesitated, then added, "Elizabeth, I want you to know you're safe here. No one will force you to do anything you don't want to do." The sincerity in his eyes made her throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, Wyatt. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "No need for that," he said firmly. "Just get some rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." A brisk knock at the door announced the arrival of Mrs. Peterson, a plump woman in her 50s with gray hair hastily tucked under a cap and sharp eyes that took in Elizabeth's condition in one comprehensive glance. "Land's sakes, Mr. Reed, what have you brought home this time?" she exclaimed, bustling forward. "The poor girl looks half dead on her feet. Come along, miss. Let's get you cleaned up and into some proper clothes." Before Elizabeth could protest, Mrs. Peterson had ushered her down the hallway to a small bedroom. A copper tub was already being filled by a young man carrying buckets of steaming water. "Miguel," she presumed. "Thank you, Miguel," Mrs. Peterson said. "That'll do. Now go on back to bed." As the door closed behind him, Mrs. Peterson turned to Elizabeth. "Now then, let's get you out of those ruined clothes." Mr. Reed said your name is Elizabeth. Yes, madam. Elizabeth Morgan. Mrs. Peterson nodded approvingly. A proper name. I'm Agnes Peterson, but everyone calls me Mrs. Peterson, even Mr. Reed, though I've told him 100 times that Agnes would do just fine. She helped Elizabeth out of her torn dress, clucking sympathetically at the bruises and rope burns on her wrists. Whoever did this needs a good thrashing. Elizabeth remained silent as Mrs. Peterson helped her into the bath, too tired and overwhelmed to explain. The warm water was heavenly against her aching muscles, and she nearly fell asleep as the older woman gently washed her hair. There now, Mrs. Peterson said, helping her out and wrapping her in a towel. I've brought one of my nightgowns. It'll be too large, but it's clean and whole, which is more than can be said for what you were wearing. The cotton nightgown enveloped Elizabeth like a tent, but it was indeed clean and smelled of lavender. Mrs. Peterson helped her into the bed, which had been freshly made with crisp sheets. Rest now, the older woman said, her tone gentler than before. Whatever trouble you're in, you're safe here. Mr. Reed is a good man, the best I know. Elizabeth nodded sleepily. He saved me. Mrs. Peterson patted her hand. That sounds like him. Now sleep. Things always look better in the morning. As the door closed behind Mrs. Peterson, Elizabeth sank deeper into the pillow, inhaling the clean scent of the linens. Her last conscious thought was of Wyatt's blue eyes, kind and steady in his weathered face. Morning arrived with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting under her door. Elizabeth woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. The events of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up, wincing at her sore muscles. A soft knock at the door was followed by Mrs. Peterson's voice. Miss Morgan? Are you awake? Yes, come in, Elizabeth called, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Mrs. Peterson entered carrying a tray. Brought you some breakfast, and a dress that might fit you better than that nightgown. It belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to Denver. She set the tray on the bedside table. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and decent. Elizabeth eyed the simple blue calico dress gratefully. It's perfect. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. The older woman nodded. Eat your breakfast while it's hot. Mr. Reed is waiting to speak with you when you're ready. No rush, though. She hesitated at the door. He told me a bit about your situation. Not everything I expect, but enough. You've got friends here, Miss Morgan. After Mrs. Peterson left, Elizabeth ate the hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits with more appetite than she'd felt in months. The dress, as promised, fit reasonably well, though it was a bit loose in the waist. There was even a hairbrush and pins on the dresser, allowing her to tame her tangled locks into a simple bun. When she emerged into the main room, Wyatt was seated at the table with a cup of coffee and a ledger open before him. He looked up at her entrance, and something flickered in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. "Good morning," he said, rising politely. "You look much better." Elizabeth smiled, suddenly shy. "I feel much better. Thank you for your hospitality. Please sit." Wyatt gestured to a chair. "Coffee?" Elizabeth nodded, and he poured her a cup from the pot on the stove. They sat in awkward silence for a moment, each waiting for the other to speak. "I've been thinking," they both said simultaneously, then laughed, breaking the tension. "Ladies first," Wyatt said with a smile. Elizabeth wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "I've been thinking about what to do next. I can't impose on your kindness indefinitely. Perhaps I could still make my way to San Antonio. I'm a competent seamstress, and your stepfather will be looking for you." Wyatt interrupted gently. San Antonio would be the first place he'd search. And a young woman alone. He shook his head. "It's not safe. What alternative do I have?" Elizabeth asked. I can't stay here forever. Wyatt looked uncomfortable. Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss. I had Frank ride into town this morning to see what news there might be. Elizabeth tensed. And Bentley's offered a reward for information about you. A substantial one. Wyatt's expression was grim. He's claiming you stole money and jewelry before running away. That's a lie, Elizabeth exclaimed. I took nothing but the clothes on my back and his horse, which I had every intention of sending back once I reached safety. I believe you, Wyatt assured her. But it complicates matters. The law will be looking for you too now. Elizabeth felt the weight of despair settling over her again. Then I'm trapped. If I can't go to town, and I can't stay here, you can stay here, Wyatt said firmly. But we need a better explanation for your presence than the truth. He took a deep breath. I have a proposal that might solve both our problems. Elizabeth looked at him warily. What kind of proposal? A marriage of convenience, Wyatt said, his expression serious. As my wife, you'd have my protection and my name. No one would question your presence here, and Bentley would have no legal claim on you. Elizabeth stared at him, speechless. Of all the solutions she might have imagined, this was not one of them. I know it's sudden, Wyatt continued, rushing to fill the silence. And I'm not expecting. That is, it would be in name only until you decide what you truly want. You'd have your own room, of course, and if you ever wished to leave, I wouldn't stop you. Why would you do this? Elizabeth asked, finding her voice at last. You barely know me. Wyatt's gaze was steady. I know enough. I know you're brave and determined. I know you've been mistreated and deserve better. And selfishly, I could use a wife. This ranch needs a woman's touch, and the truth is, I'm lonely. He spread his hands in a gesture of openness. It's not a romantic notion, I know, but it could be a practical solution for both of us. Elizabeth considered his words carefully. Wyatt Reed was certainly handsome in a rugged way, and everything she'd seen suggested he was kind and honorable. Still, marriage was a serious commitment, even one entered into for practical reasons. May I have some time to think about it? She asked. Of course, Wyatt replied, looking relieved that she hadn't immediately refused. Take all the time you need. In the meantime, you're welcome to stay here as my guest. Elizabeth nodded. Thank you. And may I help with chores while I'm here? I'm not accustomed to idleness. Wyatt's smile returned. Mrs. Peterson would probably appreciate some help with the mending. And if you're inclined, the garden could use some attention. My thumbs are decidedly not green. I'd like that, Elizabeth said, returning his smile. The next few days fell into a comfortable routine. Elizabeth spent mornings helping Mrs. Peterson with household tasks, cooking, cleaning, and mending the ranch hands' clothes. In the afternoons, she worked in the small kitchen garden, weeding and tending to the vegetables that supplemented the ranch's meals. Wyatt was often busy with ranch work, but he made a point to join her for meals and in the evenings would sit with her on the porch, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. She learned about his childhood in Missouri, his journey west after the war, and his dreams for the ranch. In turn, she shared stories of her own childhood, her love of books, and her mother's teachings about herbs and healing. Each day that passed made the idea of marrying Wyatt less frightening and more appealing. She observed how he treated his workers with respect, how he never raised his voice in anger, how he took time to listen to concerns and offer thoughtful solutions. He was nothing like her stepfather or Edgar Whitmore. On the fifth day, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Elizabeth made her decision. I've been thinking about your proposal, she said quietly. Wyatt turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral. And I accept, Elizabeth said, meeting his gaze steadily. "But I have conditions." "Name them," Wyatt replied without hesitation. "First, I want to be a true partner in this ranch, not just a housekeeper. I want to learn everything about running it, so if something happened to you, I could carry on." Wyatt nodded. "That's sensible. What else?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Second, if we find that there might be more between us than convenience, we'll be honest with each other about it." A slow smile spread across Wyatt's face. "I can certainly agree to that condition." "And third," Elizabeth continued, her cheeks warming under his gaze, "if at any point I wish to leave, you'll help me establish myself elsewhere, safely away from my stepfather." Wyatt's smile faded, but he nodded. "You have my word, though I hope it won't come to that." Elizabeth extended her hand formally. "Then we have an agreement, Mr. Reed." Wyatt took her hand, but instead of shaking it, he turned it over and pressed a gentle kiss to her palm, sending an unexpected shiver up her arm. "We do indeed, Miss Morgan. Soon to be Mrs. Reed." The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church in Willow Creek, with Reverend Thompson officiating. Wyatt had ridden into town himself to make the arrangements, returning with a simple gold band and news that Bentley had expanded his search to neighboring counties. "He's determined to find you," Wyatt told her grimly. "But once we're married, his claim on you ends. You'll be under my protection legally." Elizabeth wore Mrs. Peterson's daughter's best dress, a cream-colored cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Peterson had taken it in at the waist and lengthened the hem, and even found a small bouquet of wildflowers for Elizabeth to carry. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. Frank stood as Wyatt's best man, while Mrs. Peterson served as Elizabeth's matron of honor. As she spoke her vows, Elizabeth found herself meaning every word, despite the unusual circumstances of their union. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them man and wife, Wyatt's kiss was gentle and brief, but it left Elizabeth with a fluttering sensation in her stomach that lingered long after they'd signed the marriage certificate and ridden back to the ranch. That evening, Mrs. Peterson prepared a special dinner to celebrate, and the ranch hands toasted the newlyweds with glasses of whiskey Wyatt had been saving for a special occasion. As promised, Wyatt escorted Elizabeth to her own room when the celebration ended, kissing her hand at the door with a gentle "Good night, Mrs. Reed." Alone in her room, Elizabeth touched her new wedding ring, still strange and unfamiliar on her finger. "Mrs. Reed," she whispered to herself, testing the sound of it. Felt right, somehow, in a way she hadn't expected. The next morning, true to his word, Wyatt began teaching Elizabeth about ranch operations. She accompanied him on his rounds, learning about cattle management, fence maintenance, and water rights. Though she had grown up on a small ranch, her mother had kept her focused on household matters, and there was much she didn't know about the business side of ranching. Wyatt proved to be a patient teacher, explaining concepts clearly and answering her many questions without condescension. Elizabeth absorbed everything eagerly, determined to be the partner she had promised to be. As weeks passed, they fell into a new routine. Mornings were spent working together on ranch tasks. Afternoons often found Elizabeth helping Mrs. Peterson or tending to the garden, which was now flourishing under her care. Evenings were for conversation on the porch or reading aloud from one of the few books Wyatt owned, mostly practical manuals on ranching, but also a well-worn copy of the Iliad that had belonged to his father. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the nature of their relationship began to shift. Elizabeth found herself watching Wyatt when he wasn't looking, admiring the way he moved with easy grace despite his size, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the gentleness of his hands when treating an injured calf or helping her across a stream. For his part, Wyatt seemed increasingly attentive, finding reasons to be near her, his hand lingering when he helped her mount her horse, his eyes seeking hers across the dinner table. Yet he maintained the respectful distance he had promised, never pressuring her for more than she was ready to give. 6 weeks after their wedding, everything changed. Frank rode in at dusk, his horse lathered with sweat, his expression grim. "Bentley's in town," he announced without preamble. "With 3 men. They're asking questions about new brides." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. Wyatt moved immediately to her side, his arm going around her shoulders. "Did they mention us specifically?" he asked, his voice calm despite the tension evident in his posture. Frank shook his head. "Not that I heard. But they're working their way through every ranch and farm in the county. It's only a matter of time before they head this way." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "We knew this might happen. We're legally married, and Elizabeth is my wife. Bentley has no claim on her anymore." "He's not a man who cares much about legal niceties," Frank pointed out. "And those men with him look like trouble." "Then we'll be ready for them," Wyatt said firmly. "Frank, tell Miguel and Joe to keep watch in shifts tonight. Any rider approaches, I want to know about it." Frank nodded and headed back out to the bunkhouse. Wyatt turned to Elizabeth, his expression softening with concern. "Are you all right?" Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. "I won't let him intimidate me anymore. This is my home now, and you're my husband. He has no power over me." Wyatt's eyes warmed at her words. "That's right. And I'll protect what's mine." Something in his tone made Elizabeth's heart skip a beat. "Wyatt!" Before she could continue, Mrs. Peterson bustled in from the kitchen. "Supper's ready. Whatever trouble's brewing can wait until after you've eaten." Wyatt smiled at the older woman's practical approach. "You're right as always, Mrs. Peterson." He offered his arm to Elizabeth. "Shall we, Mrs. Reed?" Dinner was a quiet affair, the threat of Bentley's arrival hanging over them like a storm cloud. Afterward, Wyatt checked his rifle and pistol, cleaning and loading them with methodical care while Elizabeth watched from her chair by the fire. "I've never fired a gun," she admitted. "Mother thought it unladylike." Wyatt looked up from his task. "Would you like to learn? It's a useful skill out here." Elizabeth considered the idea. "Yes, I think I would. Tomorrow then, if all is quiet." Wyatt set the rifle aside and came to kneel beside her chair. "Elizabeth, I want you to know something. Whatever happens, I won't let him take you. Not ever." Elizabeth reached out to touch his cheek, a gesture she had never allowed herself before. "I know." Wyatt caught her hand and turned it to press a kiss to her palm, just as he had the day she accepted his proposal. This time, though, he didn't stop there. His lips traveled to her wrist, lingering over the faded marks from the rope that had once bound her. "I should have killed him when I found you," he murmured against her skin. "Then you wouldn't be the man I've come to admire," Elizabeth replied softly. Wyatt looked up, his eyes darkening with an emotion she had seen glimpses of but never so openly displayed. "Elizabeth, I know we agreed to a marriage of convenience, but I find that a sharp knock at the door interrupted him. Frank's voice called out, "Riders coming, boss. 4 of them." Wyatt was on his feet instantly, reaching for his rifle. "Stay inside," he told Elizabeth firmly. "No," she replied, standing as well. "We face this together." Wyatt hesitated, then nodded. "Together, then. But stay behind me." They stepped onto the porch just as 4 riders pulled up in the yard. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to recognize Harold Bentley at the head of the group. He was a heavy-set man with a florid face and small, mean eyes that narrowed when he saw Elizabeth. "There you are, you ungrateful little thief," he called, dismounting with surprising agility for his size. "I've spent good money tracking you down." "Good evening, Mr. Bentley," Wyatt said, his voice deceptively calm. "I'm afraid you're trespassing on private property." Bentley sneered. "I've come for what's mine." That girl stole from me and ran off with my best horse. That's a lie, Elizabeth said, stepping forward to stand beside Wyatt. I took nothing but the clothes on my back. And the horse was returned to your ranch 2 days after she left, Wyatt added. My foreman delivered it personally. Bentley waved this aside impatiently. She's still coming back with me. I've got a contract for her marriage to Edgar Whitmore, and I intend to see it honored. I'm afraid that's impossible, Wyatt said, shifting his rifle slightly. Miss Morgan is now Mrs. Reed. We were married by Reverend Thompson in Willow Creek 6 weeks ago. I have the certificate inside if you'd care to see it. Bentley's face darkened with rage. I never gave permission for any marriage. She's 21 years old, Wyatt replied evenly. She doesn't need permission. Elizabeth felt a surge of gratitude for Wyatt's foresight. They had told the Reverend she was 21, though in truth she wouldn't reach that age for another month. It was a small deception, but one that strengthened their legal position considerably. You've been tricked, mister, Bentley said, changing tactics. She's a liar and a thief. Whatever she's told you. I know exactly who my wife is, Wyatt interrupted, his voice hardening. And I know who you are too, Bentley. A coward who ties women to fence posts and forces them into unwanted marriages for profit. He raised his rifle slightly. Now, I suggest you and your friends get back on your horses and ride away before this gets ugly. One of Bentley's companions, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, moved his hand toward his holster. You're outnumbered, Reed. Not as much as you think, came Frank's voice from the shadows near the barn. The distinctive sound of a shotgun being cocked followed his words. Miguel and Joe emerged from other positions, both armed. Bentley glared at them all, his face contorted with fury. This isn't over. That girl belongs to me. Her mother's land belongs to me. My mother's land, Elizabeth corrected him, finding strength in Wyatt's solid presence beside her, which you acquired through deception and cruelty. If anyone has a claim to it, it's me. You'll never prove that in court, Bentley spat. Perhaps not, Elizabeth conceded. But I don't need the land anymore. I have a new home and a husband who treats me with respect. That's worth more than any amount of land or money. Wyatt's arm came around her waist, a public declaration of his support. You heard my wife, Bentley. She's made her choice. Now make yours, leave peacefully or face the consequences. For a tense moment, Elizabeth thought Bentley would choose violence. His hand twitched toward his gun, and she felt Wyatt tense beside her. Then, with a string of vicious curses, Bentley turned and stomped back to his horse. This isn't over, he threatened again as he mounted. You'll regret crossing me, both of you. Good night, Mr. Bentley, Wyatt replied calmly. Safe travels. They watched in silence as the 4 riders galloped away, their figures growing smaller in the moonlight until they disappeared over a rise. They'll be back, Frank said grimly. Maybe, Wyatt agreed, but not tonight. Double the watch anyway, just to be safe. As Frank and the others moved away to take up their positions, Elizabeth turned to face Wyatt. Thank you, she said simply. Wyatt looked down at her, his expression softening. For what? For standing by me. For giving me a home. For making me feel safe for the first time in years. Wyatt touched her cheek gently. You don't need to thank me for that. Elizabeth leaned into his touch. Before they arrived, you were about to say something. A smile touched Wyatt's lips. I was. Will you tell me now? Instead of answering, Wyatt lowered his head and kissed her. Unlike the brief, chaste kiss they had shared at their wedding. This was a kiss of genuine, feeling tender at first, then deepening as Elizabeth responded, her arms slipping around his neck. When they finally parted, both breathing a little faster, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers. I was going to say that I find myself falling in love with my wife. The arrangement may have started as one of convenience, but my feelings are anything but convenient now. Elizabeth's heart soared at his words. I feel the same way, she admitted. I've been afraid to say it. Afraid you might think I was just grateful and confused. And now? Wyatt asked, his hands warm at her waist. Now I know it's more than gratitude, Elizabeth replied. It's admiration and respect and desire and love. I love you, Wyatt Reed. Wyatt's smile was radiant in the moonlight. And I love you, Elizabeth Reed. This time when he kissed her, there was no hesitation, no holding back. Elizabeth melted against him, feeling the strength of his arms around her, the solid beat of his heart against her own. When they broke apart, breathless and flushed, Wyatt looked at her with a question in his eyes. Tonight, Elizabeth whispered, answering his unspoken query. I don't want to spend another night alone. Wyatt's eyes darkened with desire. Are you sure? Elizabeth nodded, suddenly shy but certain. I'm sure. Hand in hand, they walked back into the house, closing the door on the world outside. That night, their marriage truly began. No longer one of convenience, but one of deep and growing love. Morning found them tangled together in Wyatt's bed, Elizabeth's head pillowed on his chest, his arm wrapped protectively around her. Sunlight streamed through the window, turning her hair to gold against the white sheets. Wyatt watched her sleep, marveling at how quickly and completely she had changed his life. 6 weeks ago, he had been a solitary man focused solely on his ranch. Now he was a husband with someone to care for, someone who cared for him in return. The change was profound and he realized exactly what he had been missing. Elizabeth stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment she looked confused, then her gaze found his and she smiled. A slow, sweet smile that made his heart skip a beat. Good morning, husband, she murmured. Wyatt leaned down to kiss her softly. Good morning, wife. Elizabeth stretched languidly against him. What time is it? I should help Mrs. Peterson with breakfast. It's early yet, Wyatt assured her, tracing the curve of her shoulder with his fingertips. And Mrs. Peterson knows not to expect you this morning. Elizabeth blushed prettily. Does she? I may have mentioned that we might sleep late, Wyatt admitted with a grin. She's a practical woman. I'm sure she understands. Elizabeth hid her face against his chest. I'll never be able to look her in the eye again. Wyatt chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly beneath her ear. She'll be thrilled. She's been dropping hints about grandchildren since the day you arrived. Elizabeth looked up at him, suddenly serious. Would you want that? Children? With you? Wyatt's expression softened. More than anything, but only when you're ready. Elizabeth touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. I think I'd like that very much someday soon. They spent the morning in bed, talking, dozing, and loving, learning each other's bodies and hearts more thoroughly with each passing hour. When they finally emerged, Mrs. Peterson gave them a knowing look but said nothing beyond offering to bring lunch to the porch if they wanted to enjoy the fine weather. The threat of Bentley's return hung over them in the days that followed, but as weeks passed with no sign of him or his men, they began to hope he had accepted defeat. Fall arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and changing leaves. The cattle were fat and healthy, promising a good return when it came time to drive them to market. Elizabeth had fully embraced her role as Wyatt's partner, learning to ride better, to shoot with surprising accuracy, and to understand the complex business of ranching. She had also begun using her mother's knowledge of herbs to treat minor injuries and illnesses among the ranch hands, earning their respect and gratitude. Their love deepened with each passing day, expressed in both words and actions, Wyatt bringing her wildflowers from his rides, Elizabeth reading to him in the evenings, both of them working side by side to build something meaningful together. 3 months after their confrontation with Bentley, news reached them that changed everything. Frank returned from town with supplies and information. "Bentley's dead," he announced as he unloaded the wagon. "Shot in a card game in San Antonio. Apparently accused the wrong man of cheating." Elizabeth received the news with mixed emotions. She couldn't mourn the man who had made her mother's life miserable and threatened her own freedom, but neither could she rejoice in anyone's violent death. "What happens to his ranch now?" Wyatt asked. Frank shrugged. "According to Jenkins at the general store, there's no clear heir. Whitmore's trying to claim it based on some agreement they had, but the bank is involved too. Might end up being sold to settle debts." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Wyatt turned to Elizabeth with a thoughtful expression. "How would you feel about buying your mother's land? With Bentley gone, it might be possible." Elizabeth considered the idea. "It was my home for so long," she said slowly, "but this is my home now with you." She placed her hand on her stomach, which had just begun to show the slightest curve. "With our family." Wyatt's eyes widened, his gaze dropping to where her hand rested. "Elizabeth, are you?" She nodded, her eyes shining with happy tears. "Dr. Matthews confirmed it when I went into town with Mrs. Peterson last week. We're going to have a baby in the spring." Wyatt was off the porch swing in an instant, kneeling before her and gathering her hands in his. "A baby?" he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "Our baby." Elizabeth laughed at his expression of amazed joy. "Yes, our baby." "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," Wyatt said, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "I love you so much, Elizabeth Reed." "And I love you," she whispered against his ear, "more than I ever thought possible." Wyatt drew back to look at her, his expression becoming serious. "About your mother's land, I wasn't thinking of moving there. I was thinking we could add it to the Lazy R. It's good grazing land, and with a baby coming, we might want to expand." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like that. It would be a way to honor my mother's memory, to keep the land in the family as she would have wanted." "Then we'll look into it," Wyatt promised. "Tomorrow I'll ride into town and speak with the banker." The acquisition of the Bentley property or the Morgan property, as Wyatt insisted on calling it, proceeded more smoothly than they had anticipated. With evidence of Bentley's outstanding debts and Elizabeth's legitimate claim as his stepdaughter, they were able to purchase the land for a fair price, expanding the Lazy R to nearly twice its original size. Winter came, bringing cold winds and occasional snow. Elizabeth's pregnancy progressed without complications, though she found herself tiring more easily. Wyatt insisted she rest whenever needed, often bringing his paperwork into the bedroom so she wouldn't feel isolated. Mrs. Peterson knitted constantly tiny blankets, caps, and booties in both blue and pink, unwilling to guess the baby's gender. "A healthy child is all that matters," she declared firmly. As Elizabeth's time grew near, Wyatt arranged for a midwife to stay at the ranch, not willing to risk a dash to town if the baby came during bad weather. Mary Hawkins was a cheerful, competent woman who had delivered hundreds of babies and put Elizabeth immediately at ease with her practical approach and wealth of knowledge. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers across the prairie and the sound of newborn calves calling to their mothers. Elizabeth watched from the porch, her hands resting on her now prominent belly, feeling the baby kick and move within her. "Restless today," she commented as Wyatt joined her, fresh from inspecting a new section of fence. "Takes after his mother," Wyatt teased, placing his hand beside hers to feel the movement. "Always on the go." "Or her father," Elizabeth countered with a smile. "Always busy with something." Wyatt kissed her temple. Either way, he or she is loved already. Labor began that night, with Elizabeth waking to a sharp pain and a gush of fluid. Wyatt was instantly alert, sending Frank to fetch Mary while Mrs. Peterson heated water and prepared the bedroom. The birth was long and difficult. Elizabeth's labor continued through the night and into the following day, her strength gradually waning despite her determination. Wyatt stayed by her side throughout, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement when she felt she couldn't continue. "You're the strongest person I know," he told her during a particularly difficult contraction. "You can do this. I believe in you." As the sun began to set on the second day, Mary announced that the baby was finally in position. "One more big push, Elizabeth," she urged. "Your child is almost here." Gathering her remaining strength, Elizabeth bore down with everything she had. There was a moment of searing pain, then an indescribable relief as the baby slipped into the world with a lusty cry. "A girl," Mary announced triumphantly, quickly wrapping the squalling infant in a clean blanket. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face as Mary placed the tiny bundle in her arms. She looked down at her daughter's red, wrinkled face, the wispy dark hair, the perfectly formed fingers that curled around her own. "She's perfect," Elizabeth whispered. Wyatt sat beside her on the bed, his own eyes wet with tears. "She is," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like her mother." "What shall we name her?" Elizabeth asked, leaning against his shoulder. Wyatt touched their daughter's cheek with a gentle finger. "What about Hope? Because that's what she represents to me. Hope for the future, for our family." "Hope?" Elizabeth repeated, smiling down at the now quiet baby. "Hope Reed. I love it." The months that followed were a blur of feeding, changing, and marveling at each new development. Hope grew quickly, her dark hair giving way to golden curls like her mother's, her eyes remaining the same vivid blue as her father's. She was a cheerful baby, quick to smile and slow to cry, capturing the hearts of everyone on the ranch. Elizabeth recovered her strength gradually, soon resuming her duties around the ranch while keeping Hope close in a sling Mrs. Peterson had fashioned. Wyatt took every opportunity to hold his daughter, often carrying her with him on his morning inspections, pointing out cattle and horses, wildflowers and birds, narrating the world to her as if she understood every word. On Hope's first birthday, they held a small celebration with the ranch hands and a few neighbors who had become friends. As twilight fell and the guests departed, Elizabeth and Wyatt sat on their familiar porch swing, Hope sleeping peacefully between them. "Happy?" Wyatt asked, his arm around Elizabeth's shoulders. Elizabeth looked out at the land they had built together, the thriving ranch, the expanded garden, the new barn under construction, then back at her husband's beloved face and their sleeping daughter. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "I never imagined life could be this good." Wyatt pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "When I found you tied to that fence post, I thought I was just doing what anyone would do, helping someone in trouble. I had no idea I was finding my future, my heart." Elizabeth turned her face up to his. "Do you ever regret it? Bringing home a strange woman with a vengeful stepfather? Taking on all that trouble?" "Not for a single moment," Wyatt replied without hesitation. "Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Everything good in my life, our marriage, our daughter, our home, all of it started with that moment." Elizabeth reached up to touch his face. "I love you, Wyatt Reed. Today, tomorrow, always." "And I love you, Elizabeth Reed," he responded, lowering his head to kiss her gently. "Forever and always." Hope stirred between them, making a small sound before settling back into sleep. They both looked down at their daughter, their expressions filled with the same tender love. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Elizabeth thought about the journey that had brought her here from fear and desperation to love and security. The path had not been easy, but every step had led her to this perfect moment, with her husband and child beside her and a future bright with promise. The rope that had once bound her to a fence post had been cut, not just by Wyatt's knife but by his love, freeing her to become the woman she was meant to be: strong, loving, and completely her own person. What had begun as an act of rescue had transformed into a partnership of equals, building a life together on the foundation of mutual respect and deepening love. In the years that followed, the Lazy are prospered, eventually becoming one of the most successful ranches in the county. Hope grew into a spirited young woman with her mother's determination and her father's kind heart. She was joined by two brothers: William, born 2 years after her, and James, who arrived 3 years later. Elizabeth became known throughout the region for her knowledge of herbal medicine, often called upon to assist with illnesses when the doctor was unavailable. Wyatt served on the town council, helping to guide Willow Creek's growth with the same thoughtful care he applied to his ranch and family. But no matter how busy their lives became, they never forgot how their story began with a desperate young woman, a fence post, a length of rope, and a cowboy whose compassion changed everything. Each year on their anniversary, Wyatt would present Elizabeth with a single wildflower, a simple reminder of their beginning and a promise of their enduring love. And each night, no matter what challenges the day had brought, they would sit together on their porch swing, watching the sun set over the land they had made their own, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together and the love that had kept them there.